welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jason Hine, and I am here today. I am honored to have the privilege to be joined by Seth Early, founder and CEO of Early Information Science. We're here today to talk a little bit about ontologies. And Seth, you know a lot about this particularly.
And yes, indeed. And to tell you some stories that actually are coming out of my new book, which is going to be launched in April. You can see a comment from Peter Johnson, who actually has been in the AI space for many, many years and runs those programs at MetLife. And he says a great resource to separate the hype from reality and a practical guide to achieve real business outcomes using AI technology. That was very generous of him to say that. There's a foreword by Tom Davenport. If you folks know him, he wrote Only Humans Need Apply and the AI Advantage. So we're really excited about that, and we're really excited about the stories we're going to tell you today about how to be practical in your AI or just any digital transformation program and the role of ontologies.
Digital transformation is what everybody's talking about, but I don't know about you, Seth. I see everybody talking about it, but very, very few people are actually doing it. And that
realizing it in a practical way. And I think it's become a generic term people throw around.
Right. It's a buzzword that, you know, people who want to sound smart talk about. But today we're going to show people a tool that they can use to actually realize some of that benefit. So just before we get started, we've got a very quick poll that you can answer your question. Have you ever heard of ontologies? Have you heard a little bit? Do you know a lot? Are you using them as part of your operations today? Give us a sense of where you are, and let us know. That'll help us kind of frame our context as we get later in the webinar today and start answering some of your questions.
So we're going to start with a case study. Again, this is featured in the book, and it's for Applied Materials. And Applied Materials, if you know the company, they build semiconductor fabrication plants. And one of the challenges is there's a huge body of knowledge and information that the field service techs have to leverage day to day. And when these plants, when these fabs, as they call them, are down, they cost millions of dollars per day. And so they needed a way to make sure that people were getting to the information they needed. And we found that 40% of the field tech's time was spent on trying to find answers. And they had 3,000 field service techs. So the challenge is, in some cases, I know the prior slide showed a laptop, but in many cases they could not bring laptops in. They couldn't bring their laptops in because they'd be contaminated. Maybe there's one in the facility. Sometimes they had to go across the campus to get to a wireless to get to a network. And so what they did was they said, look, I'm just going to put everything in my truck that I could possibly need, and I'll be able to solve more of these problems. So they really did overload their systems in terms of being able to try to find this information. They were spending too much time because they had 30 years of legacy content. This included things like, you know, PDFs. I mean, these technologies and this equipment has a long service life. So they had to keep this information over a period of many, many years. They also had to access structured information from the ERP systems. They had to understand the as-built designs of these systems. And one of the real challenges is there's about, I think, 14 sources of information. One of the real challenges is the security constraints, because they could, if they're working in two fabrication plants that were competitors, you say Apple and IBM, they couldn't share certain information. They could solve certain problems, but other problems they would not be able to discuss or share because there's IP constraints. The other is protecting their IP, both on the equipment side from people trying to, replicate their tools and technologies, and also on the service side. So this made it very, very complex.
Wow.
In order to do that.
Yeah, that's a lot to handle. I mean, and it's not even just a lot of things. They're covering lots of different types of things. That's
yes.
You don't think about it until you think about it.
And you know, it's interesting. They tried this 3 times over a period of 5 years. And each time they failed. And the reason they failed is that they did not start with the correct foundational architecture. And this is where we began. So Jason's going to talk a little bit more about what an ontology is and then why we should care about them.
Yeah, this is going to be my test, Seth. This is going to be my test. So I've been, you know, reading. I got a sneak peek at Seth's book. I've been doing product data consulting for 5 or 6 years now, but it's really only been recently that I've been introduced to this concept of ontologies. Now, the word itself, ontology, comes from in metaphysics, and it's this very high level, broad term that describes the nature of being. And some of you are going to look at this slide and say, oh, this is kind of a little bit hippie. But in our world, in the world of information architecture, it really just describes a collection of taxonomies that focus on different topics, and then the process of weaving these taxonomies together and drawing connections to actually take the power in the taxonomies and accelerate them. So a taxonomy itself is really focused on one perspective. You know, like we've built taxonomies for things like products and customers that control for how a user views those entities and how they're arranged. Many people think of taxonomy as just navigation, right? When I'm talking to a client for the first time and they'll say, oh, taxonomy, yeah, that's my browse tree. Well, yes, that is one taxonomy, but that's not all taxonomies. And we've looked at a lot of different types of taxonomies in this space. Oops.
So I do want to make a comment on the prior slide. One of the things you saw that, and I'll just go back for a second. One of the things that you saw, you see products and you see brands. And if I want Monopoly and I'm a customer, I don't care whether it's Milton Bradley or Parker Brothers, and I don't know that. I want to go to board games. But if you're a brand manager, you do need to understand that. So the same information could be presented from different perspectives. And when you build out taxonomies, you're always building multiple taxonomies, and you're building in effect ontologies, but people don't call them that, but ontologies have another layer of sophistication that gives them much more power.
Right, and people, I think, don't think about how many taxonomies they could build. Like when they're early in their digital maturity, in their growth, right? They come in and they'll start thinking about, products and customers, and we work with clients to say, oh, these are some examples of things that we've built in the industrial equipment space. And when you really kind of think about all the different possibilities, all the things, all the points of knowledge that need to be documented, and you say, oh, wow, gosh, yeah, I guess we could create taxonomies for competitors or interests within a role or industries and environments. It gets pretty complicated.
And one of the things that I want to say is that when you're building things like content models follow a hierarchy. Metadata structures, all of them need some kind of relationships, controlled vocabularies, and so on. So there's never just a taxonomy in and of itself. There's multiple taxonomies, and they're applied in many different ways. Taxonomy starts as a conceptual list of the things that are important to the business, and then it gets broken down in lots of different ways. And as Jason was saying, there are some examples from an industrial company, but there are many, many more. If you
that's just a small slice.
That's a small slice.
Exactly.
That's what's called the domain model. And if you're life sciences, your domain model might include chemical compounds and generic names of drugs and brand names of drugs and diseases and indications and biochemical pathways.
Right.
All of those types of things.
But what's important is that to transform a collection of taxonomies into an ontology, you have to talk about this next concept, which is the relationships. What you need to do is to start to create and map and document relationships. And there's 3 different kinds that we talk about when discussing ontologies. One is an equivalence relationship. These are typically synonyms. You have this entity within your taxonomy, and it may have other terms, other words that describe it. So you create relationships between the entity itself and the different synonyms that are used to describe it. In a hierarchical relationship, many people who have built taxonomies are familiar with these. It's simply a parent-child unidimensional relationships. You can relate up and down depending on how broad or specific you're trying to capture. Associative relationships in an ontology are how you start to weave the taxonomies together. You create relationships between products and customers, products and applications, products and region to capture some of the context and the metadata that surrounds that particular entity. So for example, equivalence relationships. If you've ever worked in SEO, you're deeply familiar with these already. Misspellings, jargon terms, abbreviations, internal names. Technical names,
so cardiology,
exactly.
Heart health, for example.
Right.
But I do want to make one other comment about equivalence. It doesn't necessarily, they're conceptual, they could be antonyms. So an equivalence term, opacity and transparency, could represent the same equivalence term, but they are very different meanings.
Right, yeah. Hierarchical, again, we touched on this a little bit. It's basically starting from the top at the overall domain, working your way down into more and more specific related subcategories of entities. And then associative, this is what you see a lot of people talking about now. It's related products, it's see also, it's replacement part 4, language spoken. You start to kind of, these are the things that a lot of us in business or even in academia are really excited about now. The associative relationships are how we can start to make that vision real. So in transforming that collection of taxonomies, it's about creating those associative relationships. We know that there are relationships. Certain types of products are more suited for use in certain types of processes. We start to document those relationships. Some tasks that our clients do are more commonly done by particular types of customers. Certain environments where the work is done call for specific processes. You start to create those relationships.
Or where the part is required.
Exactly. And same thing applies to industry. So you start to see how we are essentially creating, we're weaving these concepts together. And over time, because the point of the ontology is it captures these relationships, it documents these relationships so that others can also use them, even if they're not subject experts.
And one of the things I want to point out about this is this becomes a knowledge scaffolding for the organization. It becomes a framework, and it applies to lots of different data and content sources throughout the enterprise. It becomes an asset of increasing value because it really does form that soul of the business, because you have all of these conceptual relationships, but you have knowledge of what those relationships are. How do you solve particular problems, and how do you describe the challenges and the processes, and how you can create value for your customers?
Right. And that's where the AI comes into it, right? AI, people who point AI at a big pile of data right now, because the relationships aren't documented, the context within any given taxonomy really struggles to filter the signal from the noise. And so, like, Seth, you have this great story of trying to explain this to a client, and I love it.
Yeah, let me go into that. So what's interesting is we had a situation where we had someone say, you know what, why do we need all this nonsense? Why do we need taxonomies? Why don't we just get Google? And you hear that all the time. And my response to this CFO is there a chart of accounts for your finance department? Because of course there is. I said, why don't you just get rid of your chart of accounts and get Google? And of course his answer is, don't be ridiculous. Well, a taxonomy is a chart of accounts for knowledge. Here is a financial chart of accounts. It is a hierarchy. What is the purpose? To organize, to track, to manage resources, financial resources. And you can see that's a parent-child type of a relationship. It is a hierarchy. And then what do we have when we talk about knowledge or other types of assets? This taxonomy, the knowledge chart of accounts, is to also organize, track, and manage intellectual resources. And again, there can be some correspondence between these, but they don't have to be completely aligned. But the idea is, how do you explain this to people? Is to say that, look, you have to organize information in the organization. You're never going to get rid of organizing principles. There's a fallacy about AI. It says, oh, just point the AI to it. In some cases, some AI tools do not necessarily require a reference architecture. And that's actually what Tom Davenport and I kind of debate back and forth. And he wrote about it in the forward. He said, you know, I think there's some challenges with your argument. I said, well, put them in the, don't torpedo my book, but put them in the book. And he did. And he did a very nice job of balancing this relationship. My point is that if you have machine learning applications that do not require an ontology, say it's image recognition, you can do that without a reference. But how do you apply the results? Is it for quality control? Is it manufacturing? Is it for some consumer process? How do you contextualize the results? And that's the challenge. Now, what you can see here is when we put this ontology, multiple taxonomies in place, what we found was we could use that to classify and organize the content. And of course, it was called text analytics back then, but you can see one of the icons there, it says restricted. So you could flag restricted information and you could make sure that that does not get used inappropriately. But this became the Rosetta Stone for the organization. This became the mechanism to contextualize all of those assets, those 14 different systems, have a single point of access to them and be able to give people the right information in the context of their task and their role. That is the holy grail of personalization. That is the holy grail of knowledge management. It's contextualization. We do not have information overload. We have filter failure. And that was Seth Godin, I think, said that. Another Seth. but my point is that organizations need to realize that this is an investment that has to be made, and this is what's required. There is no magic. AI will not work unless you have an underlying information architecture. So here is an example of a representation of a plant ontology, manufacturing plant. This is not the one from Applied Materials. This is the concepts will change, but you can see there are a lot of concepts here in many, many relationships and many terms, but the result was it reduced the time they spent for searching for information by 50%. That was a multi-million dollar, tens of millions of dollars of savings annually. We also have another case study in the book about Allstate, and this was the Allstate Business Insurance Expert, or ABBY. And it's interesting, at the time, they wanted to, I was working with a guy who was my client at another insurance company, and he came over, he said, oh, I need help with a taxonomy. We looked at their information and I said, no, you need much more than that. You need to have that content componentized so that you can have a question answer system. So when people ask a question, they don't get 100 results or they don't get a 300-page document. We componentize that content. This is something that allows the contextualization of the task, again, based on the use cases, the scenarios, and the data in the right structure. And you can see all of these different vocabularies, all of these different hierarchies that had to be leveraged in this. There are thousands of terms, there are thousands of pieces of content, but this improved their call center efficiency. They had launched a new line of business insurance, and the agents had no idea how to write business insurance, so they inundated the call center with these calls. But this led to a very significant impact. And this is where you guys have to start. At the time, it's kind of funny. They wanted to put an avatar on, and I said, oh, that's ridiculous. Why would anybody want to do that? And of course, in retrospect, it was brilliant because it was a virtual assistant. And it was one of the first virtual assistants that really got traction and value.
A virtual assistant who could actually assist.
That's right, exactly. But you have to begin with that architecture. You have to begin with your use cases and scenarios. And again, there's tremendous value. This allows the ability to reuse that content in multiple contexts, multiple channels, and it helps people be productive today. This was considered kind of a helper bot, again, Allstate, and that's where you have to start. You have to start internally with your people and helping them get their jobs done. Here's another example, completely different application from the Cleveland Museum of Art, and this also leveraged ontologies. Now, they had sensor data, and it was very noisy. It required the ability to reduce the noise and be able to contextualize what those signals were. And people were tracked, of course, they opted in throughout their visit, and how they interacted with exhibits. And the objective was to increase the amount of engagement, to increase the time that they spent with exhibits. And they were able to analyze the traffic patterns, understand what features and what aspects of exhibits, if they made changes, they could measure the results. So this was an incredibly powerful application, but it also has many, many other potential applications. So optimizing flows within a retail environment, improving patterns of handling of equipment or materials in a factory, improving building efficiency. These are sensor applications, Internet of Things, and then doing things like predictive maintenance for equipment, looking at the signals that an impending failure gives off. And there's lots of examples of that in the book. But think of it this way too. That's also an ability to start providing the knowledge at the point of need. Now, that's more of a knowledge architecture and knowledge integration. But imagine that you get some signals that a machine is starting to tell you it needs maintenance. The maintenance person walks up to the machine, asks it what it needs, and it tells them. It tells them how to service them. It's the knowledge at the point of need, self-diagnosing, and then recommending the procedure. That is the holy grail of this stuff. We're going to have information and intelligence in our environment. Some people believe we will not have laptops. We will not even have iPhones. I'm not sure if I would go that far, but the idea is to embed this intelligence, and these are ways to do this. You have to contextualize this, and you can see the example of all of the different values in this ontology. And then here's another example. This predated artificial intelligence, but this was a medical insurance claims processing. And what happened was when we built this, there was a very sophisticated content model, content object model, domain model, and terminology. And this improved the handling time, reduced the call handling time for complex claims by 20%. Again, they had anesthesia claims that would be a 300-page document. Well, that doesn't help the claims processor. You need the specific answer. And it improved customer service, customer satisfaction, efficiency. And this set the foundation for AI. Didn't use AI, but it set the foundation for that. So again, this is it looks big and complex, but anytime you have these projects, you have to have a vision of where you're going. You have to be able to say, this is the North Star, and then take pieces of that and break it down. Start looking at the biggest impact business problems. This is not unique to ontologies. This is not unique to IA or AI, but it's the basics, and it requires this. Now, we have lots of methodologies in the book to get into the real detail of doing this, but again, it's about measuring the results. It's about testing. It's about iterating. And agile, everybody says, oh, we're agile. We're an agile shop. That's great. It doesn't mean you don't pay attention and spend time on the foundation. I once had someone say to me, oh, we don't use taxonomies, we use agile. It's like, what? That was a complete non sequitur.
It's like saying we use cubicles, right? Well, you still have a floor, yeah, right?
Well, that was made as much sense as, I don't like ice cream, I ride a bicycle. I mean, it had nothing to do with it, but yeah. I like your analogy better, because it does say you need that foundation.
And so these points here, I think, are also, it's really important to highlight for folks. We live in a world where ROI is so important. And if you look, we've talked about ontology as a pretty big thing. And I think the mistake that companies can make is if they look at ontology development as, well, this is going to be a 10-year project, that nobody's ever going to bite off on that. Right? So what we are encouraging people to think about here is it's all about increments. It's all about let's start with a plan, and then instead of, we're day one of a 10-year project. It's just Wednesday. Let's just get through Wednesday, and then we'll think about what we're going to do tomorrow. But this is going to be an ongoing thing. Ontology is a program, not a project.
Right. And you know, it's interesting, you're starting to see more analysts talk about the need for ontology and how it's going to be more popular. There's a great Forbes article on this, why it's going to be a big word near future. And we do have a resources page. So just AI-resources. There's a lot of content there. There's a lot of my prior articles. You know, 4 years ago when I wrote about this for IT Professional Magazine and for Computing Edge, nobody was really thinking about it at all. And now is the time. And this is another endorsement from Scott Brinker. You guys may be familiar with that ecosystem of technologies, marketing technologies.
The logo wall.
Yeah, the logo wall of 5,000 vendors. Scott read the book and he said, you know, if you're serious about AI, and you really should be, then this is going to show you how to make it an operational reality. And that was wonderful feedback from those folks. So at any rate, let's open this to questions. And Jason, what do you see there for questions?
Yeah, so if you go into the Zoom, we do have an opportunity now. Down at the bottom, there's a little icon for Q&A. And feel free to add add a question, pop it in there. You don't have to even say who you are. If other people have asked questions that you like, you know, you feel free to upvote those or downvote them.
I don't think we're seeing a lot of that. That's fine, you know, if you're just processing this, but I think.
Oh, here they come. Here they come.
There we go. All right.
Okay.
Software tools to build ontologies.
Seth, yeah. What types of software tools? How do people document? You know, it's one thing to build it. It's another thing to document it, manage it, and expand it going forward. How do you address? What do you think about it?
So building the ontology does require tools, and that requires both human judgment and some text analytics. I think the first thing to do is identify those use cases and scenarios. Then you build a domain model, which is a bigger picture view of the entire landscape. But then you drill down into particular areas. And what you would want to do is harvest your content, your high value content, and then run some analytics on those to determine the isness and aboutness. That's what I like to call, you know, the information architecture. And what you're trying to do is start to consider, you know, from your use cases, how are things conceptually related? What if you had the world's best reference librarian, they told you exactly where to go for something. Somebody might search on one topic, but they really need to understand these other pieces. So I'm trying to find a solution to my problem. Well, wait a minute, are there services that go with this? Are there products that go with this, and so on? The same thing can be done for chatbots. Those are knowledge retrieval mechanisms, and there are associated relationships there. But software is really about, it's less about software and it's more about the process and the ability to analyze use cases, scenarios, metrics, understand the metrics. And once you have, and you're starting to build the ontology, you can use ontology management tools. There's a number out there. There's some open source. I think Protege is open source. Is that right? Protege is open source, I think.
I think so.
We have WordMap, which we've used over the years. It runs Chemical Abstract's website, which every chemical compound known to humankind is in WordMap. And
some MDM software can at least provide a starting point, right?
That's right.
Like,
yeah,
that's right.
So
you're looking for a master domain management, multi-domain.
Yeah, the challenge sometimes is the semantics, and you know, depending upon the MDM tool, sometimes product information systems can have some of those relationships and so on. The next question here is ontologies and knowledge graphs, and this is from Fred Lundquist. Yes, those are, that is what it is, a knowledge graph. And when you start thinking about this, it's putting it into a format and a structure that a system can interpret and act on. We talk about high fidelity journey models in the book. And one of the things we do is model the customer across multiple dimensions and align those dimensions with the product information and with the content. And and we also have to have a knowledge architecture, because you need to understand what the human insights and judgments are about what people need, who the target customers and what they need. But all of that, journey models are usually not they're pretty pictures, but they're not interpretable by machines. When you start applying metadata to describe the intent and the journey, and you have the metadata to describe these other assets, you can orchestrate them. And yes, it becomes a knowledge graph, and it's a representation that your tools and technologies can interpret and respond to, because you're trying to orchestrate content, data, and knowledge.
Yeah, Seth, the one that's more questions coming in. This is great.
Yeah.
So here's one that I particularly like. So what kind of team do we need to build this? Is this one person that can do this? Do they need to build a team? Are you going to pull in people from existing departments to do this? I think, you know, as a consulting firm, we are legally required to say it depends, but maybe you could give some insights in terms of, I think that's an evolutionary process. How do you describe that?
Sure. So, and again, we like to say there's no magic. This is work, and you likely have multiple initiatives that are already underway that could benefit from this. What is different about this is taking a comprehensive point of view, looking at the bigger picture, and then trying to understand your processes from a holistic perspective. That is what digital transformation is about, right? And I think I used all the buzzwords I was supposed to in that last sentence. But my point is that you do need to solve problems today. And whether that takes, if you have one person and that one person needs to start doing this, they can begin by looking at the organizing principles you have, auditing the existing systems and the existing metadata structures, looking at the quality of and the consistency. Frequently, you come into an organization and you see there's a whole lot of harmonization that needs to happen right away, and there will be uplift from that alone. But I think the most important piece to not make this a science project and to continue to have executive attention, involvement, and funding is to target a process that's measurable and have an impact on that process. What I don't want to see happen is people start getting into, oh, ontology is the answer. Well, no, data hygiene and content hygiene and architecture is the answer.
Starts with that, right?
That's right. These tools have been around for a very long time, and the purpose of these tools is to reduce the cognitive load on the human. And we've always done that with lots of technologies, with every iteration and every evolution and every wave of technology. That's what it's been about. And this is a continuation of this. So when we start thinking about doing this, don't think of it as a buzzword. Don't think of it as a project. Think of it as a perspective on your environment, and think of it, if you have your taxonomies and information architecture pretty well defined, great, this is the next step. If you don't, you will have to do foundational work, but you can also start showing the power of building this semantic architecture, this semantic structure, and interrelating these different concepts across multiple systems.
Yeah. So Seth, do you think, so I'll also throw in a perspective I'd like to get your thoughts on. I think that to answer this to question, if you are starting an ontology program with the intent of just pulling people from existing jobs, right, and having them sort of consult on it and collaborate on it, in my experience, that's not necessarily the best way to go, because somebody needs to own the ontology. Like when everybody owns something, nobody owns something. And given the degree, how important it is for those relationships, those associative relationships, to be properly connected across teams, across departments, that's something where, you know, a committee is not going to do a good job about enforcing that. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think, you know, there's a couple of other observations here from the questions. You know, you need to put this in the context of stuff you already understand and know. The problem with AI and AI technologies is vendors were trying to pull new buzzwords out and create fear and create uncertainty and create confusion, so you spend a lot of money with them.
Yeah.
I've spoken with vendors who say, oh no, you don't need any of that. You don't even need a hypothesis. Our system will do it all. And that's nonsense. So one of the questions here is, isn't ontology similar to object modeling that associates object classes to behaviors, association, and collaborations? Yes, absolutely. That is a part of it. And again, it is really about finding those problems that you need to address in a meaningful way, and then looking at the ecosystem of technologies that are behind that. And if you are trying to build something with AI, one of the challenges is going from POC or a sandbox to deployment and operationalization. And I wrote an article about that. There's a whole range of things that go wrong there. But what you want to start to do is build discipline and process and maturity in multiple areas that will help you apply the ontology. The ontology is something that's going to be built over time. You're going to start with organizing principles and taxonomies, but you also need to keep in mind this broader perspective and think about how you can apply those relationships. Who is going to understand those relationships? That's where human judgment comes into play, right? What solution, what is the solution, and what is the product, and what is the need of the user? So again, basing it on use cases, scenarios, and measurable results are what's first and foremost.
Hey, Seth, the question has come up. So Christine asked about, so once the ontology is built, you have to move into a care and feeding and operational improvement process. So she's asking, are there best practices for how to review ontologies? I mean, to me, reviewing an ontology sounds like a Sisyphean task.
Yeah, right.
And it would really be about reviewing elements, components of it. Can you talk about how you break that down a little?
Sure. So one of the things that you need to think about, and I love Frederick had mentioned there's no AI without IA. That was the name of that article, and it's very true. But when you start looking at reviewing or understanding the quality, you have to break it down and starting off by looking at concepts that are important to the business and how those concepts are expressed or represented within the various technologies. So, an example I give to show you all the different contexts is if you have SharePoint and you have, say it's your professional services firm, you have methodologies. Well, you could have a whole site collection on methodologies. You could have a site that contained methodologies. You could have a library within a site that had methodologies. You could have a field, you could have a content object labeled methodologies. You could have a field within that content object as methodologies, and you could have a term at the lowest level called methodology. So one of the things we need to do is take that concept and understand how it's expressed in various systems. It'll be expressed as navigation in one system. It'll be expressed as classification in another system. But we have to look at where do we need to harmonize those. So product definitions or customer definitions or any number of processes or tasks or content types. You find that you'll have 50 different names. There was one customer where you saw status. It was a status of a knowledge article. And if you added up all the different ways they could label status, there's about 25 ways of representing the concept of status. How many do you really need? You don't need 25. And it was very confusing and people didn't understand why and when and how. So part of this is beginning to get common understanding of the concepts that are most important to the business and then focusing on how those concepts are represented in various systems, technologies, processes, workflows, and so on. But again, it sounds daunting, but the thing you want to look at is where is the pain? Where's the pain? And that's what you want to focus on. The big picture domain model will give you that holistic understanding. And then when you zero in on the measurable business objective and you tie your project to that. Now, we know every time there's ROI, everybody jumps in and claims it. Right? So you have to name it first and say, this is what we're trying to accomplish.
Right. Seth, do you think there's a, I think I like to look at this as there's sort of two approaches to a review, right? On the one hand, we are all striving to be metrics driven, right? And there's going to be reports and dashboards in the systems that come out and tell us, hey, where things are on fire right now.
Right.
But it's important that while, yes, you want to attend to those because that's what's going to be driving your ROI and your metrics that you use to report up and justify expanding the program, it is also, there is a place for a sort of scheduled review, whether it's I'm going to pick these 4 taxonomies and I'm going to go work with those teams on a project this year to, hey, let's look outside. Is the market still reflected in our taxonomy? Are there new things that have come in? Do we have to kind of do a renovation here?
Have you had drift? Have you had editorial drift, meaning people start making changes and it gets farther afield? Or maybe there's been some organic processes that have snuck in there. In other words, people have put things in without a clear change.
Without process,
Right.
Right. So that is sort of the way that I think about the review, Christine, is you know, the operational metrics, you'll be working those, you know, day in, day out. But it can be very tempting to let that just drive you. And so it is important to try to, as you have resources, identify what resources can I bring to this, and then say, all right, my team is this big and I can pull people from these other teams for short projects. Let's take, you know, a month and let's revisit our product taxonomy. Let's revisit our customer taxonomy. That is also a really good way to make sure that your department who's running the ontology continues to maintain good relationships with other teams who are touched by the taxonomy, so that they stay interested and continue to participate.
And you validate their objectives and whether you're meeting their objectives. Because again, the cost and benefits of these types of programs are not evenly distributed, right? You may need someone to expend an effort upstream that's not part of their scope and they're not measured on it. But what they do significantly impacts downstream, which can, you know, be an order of magnitude more expensive than if you solve the problem upstream. And that happens a lot with data governance, data projects, and data quality. Same thing here. I want to revisit another question that was asked, and it was what about skills? One of the things I want to say is, you know, you hear a lot about cognitive engineers or AI, you know, experts or data scientists, and these new titles. Well, it's interesting. Vodafone had deployed one of the virtual assistants that they needed to build content for. And they said there were no such things as cognitive engineers on the market. There were none. They didn't have them. They had to grow their own. They had to build their own. Well, guess what they were? They were knowledge architects. They were content architects. They were data architects. They were user experience people. So don't believe, I don't care who tells you this, that this is completely new. It's an extension of what we've been doing. And it's a necessary foundation for many things. So look at your teams and say, who understands the process? Who understands the business objective? Who understands the users? Who understands the sources of information that we need? Who understands the technology stack? Get those people, and who understands good practices around these types of architectures. And those are the people that you need. Those are the skills that you need. And start off by targeting very specific use cases and scenarios, and then building your ontology representation around that so that you can show value. Because if you don't, it's just going to be an intellectual exercise, and it's going to be very difficult to maintain interest.
Hey Seth, what's your one of my favorite questions I get is, when you're building this team internally, is it better to start with people who understand information architecture best practices, or is it better to start with people who really understand the domains you're operating in?
Wow,
your thoughts?
That's a really great question. And I think if you don't understand the information architecture considerations and methodologies and practices, no matter how well you understand the domain, you're going to end up with something that's suboptimal, because you just find that it just takes expertise and knowledge and experience to build these things effectively. You will have domain experts involved. You have to have domain experts involved. But if you just are trying to start with domain experts, you will need to make sure they get trained effectively in methodologies and information architecture. But it is also good to have, as I call it, adult supervision on the project, somebody who has the time and tenure, who has built these things before and knows what to watch out for.
Right. I could go out and build a house on my own, but the odds that that house is going to stand up over time, I'll probably get better at it over time. But the odds are I'm going to have to go back and spend a lot of money to fix things that I messed up. That's, I think, what we're trying to help people sidestep.
I also use the analogy of I could have a beautiful woodworking shop with all the tools that a master craftsman would require, but you're not going to, but the output is going to be very different from me versus somebody who has the experience of doing that.
True.
I do want to add one other piece here. Well, there's a couple things here. Critical mass of organizational data or supporting taxonomies to make it worthwhile. No, you need a valid business case. You need a use case. You need a scenario, and then you may not need a very sophisticated ontology, and that's fine. And actually, the smaller, the way you prioritize these things is across multiple dimensions. You could say, we want to prove a concept. Let's keep it small. We could say, we want to show value across the organization, so let's make it large. It depends on your objectives and the culture and the risk tolerance and your confidence in solving that problem and so on. But there's a number of different ways to slice and dice that. But smaller, typically for learning, is better, right? You can make mistakes quietly and inexpensively.
And for budgets.
And yeah, right, exactly. And I think that there's not a critical mass of taxonomies, because you'll find that even a very simple one with few data sources will start to get complex pretty quickly. And so that's what's something to keep in mind, is that it's really important to start with that foundation and really the clear business objectives. There's another one here from Frederick that says, how do we bridge platform closed and knowledge graphs, such as MS Graph, Office 365, with open ontology technologies and reuse open ontologies? That's a really great question. And I did spend some time on this a couple of years ago when some of those new tools were emerging. There wasn't an easy way to do it. I'm sure there are better ways to do it now. But the thing to keep in mind is you got to look at standards and ontologies in this way. Efficiency comes from standardization. Competitive advantage comes from differentiation. If you keep that in mind, and you look at all your projects in that way, where can I leverage standards for efficiency? Okay, that's great. GS1 standards, wonderful standards for supply chain and lots of things. But if I am using just the exact same thing as everybody else in the marketplace, where's my differentiation? Where's my competitive advantage? And the ontology will become a source of competitive advantage because it's going to be tuned to the needs of the customer and the specific use cases. If you have a better knowledge representation on your website, for example, whatever you're doing, and you can zero in on the solution to your customer's problem, or show it to them, or have it surface to them, anticipating their need, you will be successful and more successful than somebody who does not have that ability. And so the idea of making this investment as a competitive advantage, we are going to compete, all organizations are going to compete strictly on their data in the future. I mean, this is it. Our virtual world is made of data. Everything on our iPhone is data. Every experience online is data. Digital transformation is a data transformation. So these things have to be considered. But when you have a closed system, customers have to demand access to other systems and think about how you want to use those types of tools. Because you do need to think about why you want to leverage an external ontology or standard. And that would be, again, for efficiency purposes.
Yeah, I think there is also a benefit here internally within organizations, right? We are in a world where people move between jobs faster than ever. And there's a real benefit of ontology is because it captures the context behind a domain.
That's right.
As you bring in new people, if you have that ontology that people can reference, they're going to get up to speed much more quickly. They're going to fail a lot less of the time. Working for you is going to be a much more pleasant experience
That's right.
than their last
That's right.
job.
That's
That
right.
any additional year that you can add on to people's experience
Mm-hmm.
from a retention perspective in this economy
Mm.
is a benefit that you also want to measure and
Yeah.
measure an ROI on.
Yes, and internal efficiencies are very important to competition. You cannot have a seamless customer experience if you are trying to produce that with acts of heroics internally and upstream. Acts of heroics do not scale, and they burn people out, and they ultimately do not provide the experience. So you have to optimize the internal systems and the upstream systems at the same time that you're trying to do this, because every piece of information that a customer uses comes from somebody internally, right? Comes from some system or process or individual internally. And so we have to optimize those. And when you start thinking about why people are investing in, I've seen organizations build new business units, not units, but new departments for AI content. Well, guess what? AI content is human content as well, right? The same things you need to train in the AI, you need to train people. And so when you're building these things effectively, you're capturing the knowledge, you're codifying that knowledge, and you are presenting that knowledge in the context of anybody's role and job, internally or externally. And so we're trying to speed up all the information flows in the organization. We're trying to speed up the information metabolism of the enterprise so you can make faster decisions, better decisions, get products to market more quickly, understand your customers' needs, evolve faster than your competitors. That's what this is all about. It's speeding the clock, it's improving the clock speed of information in the organization. It's speeding up that information metabolism. Everything is information. We are embodiments of information. Information is what, you know, comprises an ecosystem of any sort, a biological ecosystem. So this is just an extension of natural principles that govern our world. This is not a new made up thing. This is something that is just part of our world and part of our environment and part of the business landscape. Any other comments? I'm sorry, Jason, I can't hear you, Jason.
Oh, so yeah, so we got one more from Frederick asking about reuse of open vocabularies, terminologies, and ontologies to enrich internal business language.
Mm-hmm. So here's where.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, here's where I think of this as a you're trying to enrich and you're trying to normalize, right? So if you think about business language, one of the big problems, one of the reasons why we try to apply AI to our problems today is to make up for our past sins in data and content hygiene, okay? That's what we're trying to do. So when you have an AI and a machine learning interpretation of user intent, and it says, well, you know, I need statement of work versus SOW versus proposal versus this or that. The way we handled that in the past was with a thesaurus, right? You still need to standardize on language, but you have much more tolerance. Your systems have more tolerance to language variations if you apply machine learning and ontology correctly. And so what that will do is it'll start getting the organization to be more consistent in language and to be able to tag consistently. Machines tag consistently, humans tag inconsistently, and humans don't like to tag at all, really. But it's really about being able to streamline those data sources so that you're not constantly reinventing things, you're not constantly searching things, you can't find this, you can't find that. And so it will improve communication, and it will improve the ability to connect with experts because you will be able to identify those experts, and you can surface different experts in different contexts. One of the POCs we built for a financial services company took a search term and it surfaced the individuals who had expertise in that domain, in that area, when you did that search, because you wanted to find not only documents, but you also wanted to find experts. So depending upon the search term, you would surface different experts. You're just doing a federated search, or in a much more fault-tolerant way.
Yeah.
Oh boy, chatbot.
Here we go.
Yes, chatbots excluded. All right. So what are some of the best applications of robust ontology in the chat tool? here's what's challenging. I've had some companies say to me, we really love your methodologies and your thinking, and then we like your help, or I've said, I'd like to learn more about how you're leveraging knowledge architecture, because you have to have that. And then as I pushed and pushed and pushed, they resisted and didn't want to show me stuff. Now, I don't know whether that's because of propriety or maybe the emperor had no clothes. I don't know. But in some cases, they're not using it at all. I saw one chatbot vendor that was using question answer pairs in an administrative console with question variations and spelling variations. And that's like, you're not even using anything related to machine learning here. This is so wrong, it's ridiculous. So
all machine, no learning.
Yeah, all machine, no learning. No, yeah. And the what I am looking for are the technologies, and we've integrated some. I know they said exclude ours. We've integrated some with some other tools, but it's really about the content source. Think of a chatbot as a channel. So it's less about the chatbot having the ability to use knowledge architecture, and it's more about the source. Now, the chatbot has to be able to pull information from these sources, and you need to be able to update dialogues easily when you add products or services or regions or whatever. And in some of these environments, that is a really difficult, labor-intensive thing. So look for the ability to scale and reuse pieces. And we've been experimenting with some of the typical dialogue flows, yeah, and Twilios and so on. And again, they provide value, but nobody has the solution that I would like to see in the marketplace. There's one company that I did see recently that actually had really, really good stuff. I'm not going to name them right now because I don't know what's behind the scenes, but
theoretically,
I'm trying to learn a little bit more about them. I think they have it, and I think it's a support organization. So if we take that offline, maybe I can invest. I did sign an NDA, so I have to be careful about what I say with these guys, but I haven't seen a lot of it in the marketplace.
Yeah, it's still, I think, largely more important about the process than the tool yet.
And the content and the data.
Right. So we are getting kind of close on time.
Yep.
So let's let's resume that there.
Resume.
There we go. So here's, if you want to reach out, follow up with Seth, get his thoughts on finishing that conversation. By all means, feel free to reach out.
Oh, by the way, the poll, we didn't, and I just messed up our slide deck, but it looked like 24% had no experience, 40% had a high level of understanding, 20% are using in pilots, and then about 16% are using in production. So
that's a pretty good split. Pretty good split.
It's interesting. Yeah. So feel free to reach out if you want to learn more about this stuff. If you want a career in this area, if you are, whatever you're doing, we love to hear from you, and we'd love to continue the discussion. So I want to thank Sharon, as usual, from behind the scenes. And then Jason, thank you so much for helping to pull this together. And thank you all for your time and participation today. This was great.
Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, everyone. Thanks for being with us.
Bye now.